There was a season when nothing seemed to move. No doors opened, no answers arrived, no visible progress appeared. Life looked the same, week after week. She prayed, and circumstances stayed unchanged. She obeyed, and outcomes remained quiet. She waited, and nothing shifted. This kind of season is easy to misunderstand, because faith often expects movement, change, evidence that something is happening. But here, there was none, and that silence was heavier than struggle. Struggle gives resistance. Resistance gives something to respond to, but stillness offers nothing to react against. She began to wonder if she was missing something, if she was doing something wrong, if faithfulness was being wasted in a place where nothing grew. Many leave here, not because they stop believing, but because staying feels pointless. When nothing changes, they don't rebel, they drift. She felt that temptation too, to adjust her expectations, to reduce effort, to quietly disengage from a faith that felt unproductive. But she remained, not because she felt strong, not because she felt hopeful, but because she trusted that God works, even when nothing seems to move. She realized something subtle. Change is not always visible while it is happening, and God's silence is not the same as His absence. Remaining in a season where nothing seems to change requires a different kind of faith, not faith that reacts, but faith that rests. If you are in a place where days look the same, where prayers feel unanswered, where faith feels steady but unrewarded, stay. This message is for the woman who remains faithful, even when nothing seems to change. And if these words feel close to where you are right now, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but so your heart always has a place to return when God's work feels invisible and faith asks you to remain. Now, let's walk through why seasons like this matter more than we realize. What made the season heavy was not the difficulty, it was the sameness. The days blended together. The prayers sounded familiar. The questions returned unchanged. Nothing was visibly wrong, but nothing was visibly right either. This kind of season quietly drains hope. Because effort usually expects response. Faithfulness usually hopes for fruit. Waiting usually assumes movement. But here, nothing responded. She realized how much of her faith had been shaped by feedback, answered prayers, shifted circumstances, clear direction. Those things reassured her that God was near. But now, there was no reassurance, only consistency. And consistency without change can feel meaningless. She began to ask questions. That didn't sound dramatic, but were deeply unsettling. Does this matter? Is staying doing anything? Would it make a difference if I stopped? These were not questions of rebellion. They were questions of fatigue. Fatigue from doing the same faithful things without seeing results. Fatigue from hoping quietly, from trusting invisibly, from obeying without reinforcement. She noticed how tempting it was to interpret lack of change as lack of purpose. If nothing changes, surely nothing is happening. But that assumption was not always true. She remembered how God often works below the surface. Seeds break open underground. Roots grow unseen. Foundations are laid quietly. Nothing looks different. Until suddenly, everything is. God was not asking her to stay because the season was productive. He was asking her to stay because He was present. Remaining in an unchanged season required faith that did not measure worth by visible outcome. It required trusting that faithfulness has value, even when it looks repetitive. She began to understand that discouragement often comes not from suffering, but from invisibility. And God was teaching her how to remain faithful when faith could not be proven. As the season continued, faith began to feel repetitive. The same prayers, the same routines, the same choices, day after day. Nothing new to report, nothing exciting to share, nothing to point to and say, "Here, this is what God did." Repetition can feel discouraging when we expect novelty. She realized how much she associated spiritual growth with movement. New insights, new direction, new clarity. But this season offered none of that. Only repetition. And repetition tests motive. It asks a quiet question. Would you still be faithful if nothing felt new? Because repetition strips faith of stimulation. It removes momentum. It removes adrenaline. It removes the sense of progress. What remains is devotion. She noticed how easily repetition can be mistaken for stagnation. But God was not repeating himself because he had nothing else to say. He was repeating himself because she needed to live it. Truth settles slowly. Trust deepens gradually. Faith matures through consistency. God was not bored with her obedience. He was building endurance. Repetition was forming habits that did not depend on excitement, patterns of faith that would not collapse. When emotion disappeared, she learned that repetition is not wasted time. It is reinforcement. Every quiet prayer was strengthening something unseen. Every faithful choice was layering trust on top of trust. This was not a season for revelation. It was a season for residents to live inside faith rather than chase after it, and staying faithful when faith feels repetitive was shaping a steadiness that no breakthrough could replace. While nothing seemed to change outwardly, something steady was happening beneath the surface. Not progress she could chart, not growth she could announce, but formation she could carry. God was doing work that did not show itself quickly, work that could not be rushed, work that did not respond to impatience, work that required time more than effort. She began to sense that unchanged circumstances were not the absence of God's activity. They were the environment for a deeper kind of work. God was strengthening her ability to remain, to stay present without needing relief, to trust without visible reinforcement, to obey without emotional return. These qualities are not built in seasons of change. They are built in seasons of sameness when nothing moves. We are forced to confront what sustains us. If faith depends on novelty, it weakens here. If faith depends on outcome, it thins here. But if faith depends on God Himself, it deepens. Realized that God was not trying to fix her situation yet. He was stabilizing her heart. Because hearts that have learned to remain can handle change without panic when it finally comes. God was preparing her, not for this season, but for what would follow it. And preparation often looks invisible while it is happening. She learned to stop asking, "When will this end?" and began trusting. This is not empty. God was teaching her that staying was not passive. It was active trust, trust that something meaningful was forming even when nothing obvious was changing, and that realization gave her quiet strength. Not excitement, not anticipation. Strength to remain. As the season stretched on, she began to understand something deeper. Remaining was no longer neutral. It was a choice not to disengage, a choice not to grow cold, a choice not to quietly withdraw, just because nothing was changing. Staying required intention, because when nothing changes, it becomes easy to do the minimum, to pray without expectation, to obey without openness, to remain physically present but spiritually distant. God was inviting her to remain engaged, not striving, not forcing belief, but staying attentive. Remaining meant continuing to trust. that God was at work, even when she could not see it. She realized that this kind of season reveals where faith truly rests. If faith rests in outcomes, it weakens here. If faith rests in progress, it grows tired here. But if faith rests in God Himself, it becomes steady. God was teaching her that staying faithful, when nothing seems to change, is not about endurance alone. It is about confidence. Confidence that God's presence does not depend on visible movement. Confidence that obedience is not wasted because it looks repetitive. Confidence that remaining is not meaningless. She began to rest in the fact that God was not in a hurry. He was not anxious about timing. He was not frustrated with the pace. God was calm, and His calm became her anchor. She stayed, not because she expected change tomorrow, but because she trusted God today, and that trust was shaping her in ways no visible breakthrough ever could. In the end, she did not remain because the season improved. She remained because God was worthy. She learned that some seasons are not meant to change quickly. They are meant to deepen us. They teach us to trust without proof, to obey without excitement, to remain without reassurance. And this kind of faith does not fade when circumstances stay the same. It settles if you are in a place where nothing seems to change, where faith feels repetitive, where staying feels harder than leaving. Let this be your reminder. Remaining is not stagnation, it is trust. God is not absent because the season is quiet. He is present, working beneath the surface. If you want a place to return when faith feels unseen and growth feels invisible, consider subscribing, not for the channel, but for your journey, because the God who calls you to remain is still at work, even when nothing seems to change.